Today we're jumping back in time to a sort of digital hot zone. We're looking at a period between 2011 and 2014 where online whispers about health risks could just explode into these full-blown real-world crises. We're going to dissect exactly how these scares took root and, more importantly, what they can teach us about safety in pretty much any online space.
Okay, first things first, we got to get on the same page with the lingo, because this community had its own language. A provider is an escort. A hobbyist is a client. And BBFS, that stands for bareback full service, unprotected sex. Knowing these terms is absolutely key to understanding everything that comes next.
So, what kind of place lets this sort of panic build up? Well, it was a digital space that was basically built on a contradiction. You had this constant tug of war over risk and safety, and that made the whole environment incredibly volatile for everyone involved.
And here's the heart of that conflict. On one side, you have hobbyists who are openly asking for high-risk stuff. But on the other side, you've got providers publicly complaining about that exact pressure. But then, and this is the tricky part, some providers were quietly offering those same services, just using code words like the wife experience. It created this marketplace where nobody was ever really sure about safety.
And make no mistake, this tension wasn't just a few isolated arguments. You'd see forum posts like this one talking about a national concern, which shows you that providers felt this was a systemic, widespread problem, not just a couple of bad apples.
So, how does all this simmering tension finally boil over? Let's break down a specific case. A documented HIV scare that absolutely blew up on a popular forum back in 2011. This is literally the anatomy of how an online rumor becomes a terrifying real-world crisis.
You know, it didn't start with some big official health warning. It started the way these things almost always do, with whispers. A few vague, unconfirmed posts on a discussion board just started making the rounds.
And right here, you can watch the rumor harden into fact. It kicks off with one simple forum post. A few days later, an email adds a whole lot more fuel to the fire. By September, things are so serious people are looking for lawyers. And then, almost 2 months after it all began, a specific provider is publicly outed. Suddenly, the threat isn't abstract anymore. It's a verifiable crisis.
So what happens then? What happens when the thing everyone was whispering about becomes real? How does an entire community, and all the individuals in it, react when the threat is no longer just a theory?
To really understand the impact, let's zoom in on one person's story. This is a really personal account from a provider who got caught right in the middle of a totally separate herpes scare.
It all started with a phone call. Another provider, who had just been diagnosed with herpes, called her for support. But then came the bombshell. The provider who was sick admitted that she'd been having unprotected sex with her clients.
I mean, that put her in an impossible spot. She got a promise from the diagnosed provider to be safe, but just 2 days later, she sees a brand new online review proving that promise was broken. So now she has to choose. Does she protect her colleagues' privacy, or does she protect the community's safety?
She made a choice. When a client called saying he'd been referred by the infected provider, she warned him. And his reaction was just pure shock. He broke down telling her, "I am married." It is such a stark reminder of how these online risks create these devastating ripples out into the real world.
That experience just completely changed how she looked at risk. She started seeing her world not as some game of chance, but more like walking through a minefield, where any single misstep could be catastrophic.
And that led her to an even more powerful realization, something so simple but so profound. In a community like this, everyone's risk is connected. In her words, we all swim in the same pool. There's no such thing as an action that only affects you.
So what was her solution? It was pretty radical. She realized she couldn't control what other people did, so she took complete control over her own actions. She walked away from the most popular and profitable services, completely changing her business to put her own safety first.
Okay, so that's one person's story. But what about the community as a whole? How did everyone react when these scares became public? Well, the responses were kinda all over the place. A real mix of helpfulness, total panic, and sometimes just outright denial.
The reactions usually fell into one of 4 buckets. You had some really helpful information sharing, with users trying to warn each other. Then you had fear and panic, with clients suddenly demanding safer practices. Of course, you also had denial and defiance from people who just dismissed the warnings as propaganda. And finally, every now and then you'd get external intervention, like a police arrest that would just drag the whole thing out into the open.
And this really shows the fundamental difference here. In these forums, safety was this chaotic, do-it-yourself system built on rumors and individual judgment. Now compare that to the regulated porn industry, which, for all its own issues, at least has formal systems like mandatory testing. It's kind of like the difference between trying to navigate a hurricane on a homemade raft versus being on a ship that can see a lighthouse.
But this whole thing, it wasn't a one-and-done event. Yep, sure enough, by October 2014, it was happening all over again. This time, it was a syphilis scare in the Baltimore area. It just proves a critical point. If you don't change the system for how safety is managed, these crises are basically destined to repeat themselves.
Okay, so let's zoom out from the specifics for a minute. What does this whole period actually teach us about health and safety in any online space, especially the ones that don't have clear rules or anyone in charge?
When you really boil it down, this case study is a perfect example of the challenges in any unregulated corner of the internet. It shows how digital platforms can literally become pathways for real-world harm. It shows how fast information, and more importantly, misinformation, can spread like wildfire. And at the end of the day, it proves that when there are no rules, the entire weight of safety falls on the individual, forcing this impossible choice between personal privacy and public health.
And all of this leaves us with one final massive question, one that is honestly even more relevant today than it was back then. In all the huge, unregulated digital worlds that we all now live in, when there's no one officially in charge, who's actually responsible for keeping us safe?